Our 40th president was no ordinary politician. Well known to Americans long before running for office, Ronald Reagan led an extraordinary life. While even many of his opponents liked him, he was a serious and a controversial leader. In fact, at times he dealt with disagreement from both the left and the right. Reagan's leadership was during a crucial time in America's history. And 3 decades later, his legacy is still being debated, but there's no question that Ronald Reagan's life affected the world. Now, we have a new look at his legacy.
Hi, I'm Rachel Ferguson with the Hammond Institute at Lindenwood University, and I'm here to have a conversation with Marcus Witcher of the University of Central Arkansas about his book, Getting Right with Reagan, The Struggle for True Conservatism. Welcome to the show, Marcus.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so with regard to your book, Reagan is quite a myth. He's a legend now, both on the left and the right. What's the difference between the myth of Reagan and the true Reagan that you're trying to bring out in this book?
Yeah, so I think that something interesting developed in the mid-90s, which was that conservatives started to reconceptualize who Ronald Reagan was in the wake of sort of Bob Dole's dismal defeat in the 1996 election. They tried to redefine who Reagan was, and they tried to basically come up with a common set of sort of values, principles, policy prescriptions that would address the challenges, the challenges facing the nation in the 21st century. And out of that, we start to see the Ronald Reagan Legacy Project, headed by Grover Norquist and others, to really try to enshrine this sort of mythical Reagan, right, both into stone, but also into print, right? Dinesh D'Souza, right, wrote his book on Reagan in 1996, 1997. And so there was this attempt, right, to sort of mythologize Reagan and make him quite a bit different than what he actually was in the 1980s.
So how were conservatives conceiving of him more at the time or even before he became president?
Yeah, interestingly, when I was in graduate school, the way I sort of got started with the project was I came across a ton of sources where conservatives were actually quite critical of Reagan during the 1980s while he was in office.
Yeah.
And I brought them to my dissertation advisors and I was like, this is really weird. I've never heard about this. And they were like, we haven't ever heard about this either. You should delve into this and see if there's something there. And as I got to digging, I found tons of examples where conservatives were upset with Reagan, whether it be the O'Connor Supreme Court nomination, right, claiming that she was pro-abortion and that Ronald Reagan had violated his campaign pledge, right, to only nominate pro-life judges, or whether it was the INF Treaty, where conservatives basically said that Reagan was selling out on his own foreign policy. There are a litany of examples during the 1980s where conservatives were actually quite frustrated with the administration and specifically with President Reagan.
So how did they make the shift? How did they go from a series of frustrations to this is the hero of the conservative movement?
Yeah, so like I said, I think that the legacy building project really begins and Reagan tries to build his own legacy, of course, right after he leaves office. He has the Presidential Library and Museum, and he attempts to sort of encapsulate in the museum his own conception of what his legacy was. And when we go back and look at that, it's actually much different from the legacy that conservatives just 5 or 6 years later will reconceptualize for Reagan. So Reagan, of course, got Alzheimer's disease, right? He exits from the stage in 1994, and because he vacates the stage, there's this sort of
like a vacuum.
There's a vacuum,
yeah.
right? And so into that vacuum, conservatives can pour into the sort of Reagan silhouette, if you will, all the things they sort of wish he had been true to. So
what are some of those differences between Reagan's own conception of himself and theirs?
Yeah, so Reagan, for instance, never claimed to have won the Cold War. Right?
Really?
He gave credit to the people of Eastern Europe. Now, maybe he was just being humble, but he never claimed to have won the Cold War. He gave credit to Helmut Kohl. He gave credit to Margaret Thatcher. He gave credit to Mikhail Gorbachev, right? And with Glasnost and Perestroika. And specifically, though, he always gave credit to the people of Eastern Europe, who he said, right, rose up and demanded sort of liberty in the face of communism. And so Reagan never claimed to have won the Cold War. That's a big one. And also, when he discussed and framed the Cold War, there's actually a statue of him and Gorbachev sitting much like you and I are sitting here in the library. It's the centerpiece of Reagan's Cold War, of the Cold War exhibit. And it's the centerpiece for a reason. It's the centerpiece because Reagan frames the end of the Cold War as an accomplishment of both sides to look beyond their differences and come together. That's very different from the telling that conservatives tell today about a Ronald Reagan who stood up right in front of the Berlin Wall and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And then they flash, right, in 1996 at the convention, they actually flash from that image to an image of the wall coming down. And so conservatives at the RNC in 96 really began to sort of place these two things together. That Reagan's sort of bellicose rhetoric is what led to the decline and ultimately the tumbling, right, of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War.
He presents it almost more like a friendship, the accomplishment of a friendship.
Right, exactly, that we got beyond these sort of tensions, right? Whereas conservatives paint it, see, if only we have someone who will sort of stick to their guns, build up the military, stick to their conservative principles, right, they'll have success in the foreign policy arena, if you will, right? And of course, you can sort of see conservatives today sort of take that and apply that to, say, Iran or other sort of instances. We don't want to negotiate. We need to sort of
where
be
Reagan
more
really
bellicose.
was more making accomplishments through negotiation and compromise.
Yes. Now, it should be stated that Reagan did that after he built up, right, the military for the first 3 years. So Reagan, of course, the mantra was always like peace through strength, right? And one of the ways that you get peace is you have to come to the bargaining table with strength. And so after, deploying the Pershing missiles to Western Europe, Reagan in 1984 is able to come to the negotiating table, and he tries to get the Soviet leadership at that time to negotiate with him. And they basically say, we're not interested. You have re-election coming up. We're going to do everything we can to try and get a Democrat elected. And when Reagan is elected, they're very disappointed. And then, of course, Andropov, Chernenko dies, and Gorbachev comes to power, and the realization is in 1985, like, well, we're stuck with him, right? So Gorbachev, having a new sort of idea and policy, decides he'll go and talk with Reagan, and the two of them are able to build a friendship and a trust at Geneva that'll carry them through till Reagan leaves office in 1989.
So if what you're saying is true about how conservatives were fairly ambivalent towards Reagan, couldn't I push back on that by saying, well, he won in a landslide, right? In his second.
Yeah. So ambivalent. I don't want to. So ambivalence, I think, implies that like they didn't really care. Is that what you mean by that, or what do you?
Yeah, maybe they liked some things about him, but not others.
Yeah,
or something like that.
There's definitely like a tension, and Reagan gets reelected overwhelmingly, like because he's super successful in terms of revitalizing the economy.
Okay.
Most Americans think he restores, American morale in terms of Americans' belief in their own country and sort of the greatness of America. He restores optimism to a country that had been decimated, right, in the late 1970s by the energy crisis and by the Iran hostage crisis. But conservatives did have very, very real issues with President Reagan. If anything, I think that the fact that Reagan did so well in those elections demonstrates the bipartisan appeal, or at least the appeal to the center of America, in contrast to sort of satisfying the far right. And after Reagan's reelected in 1984, conservatives were like, yes, this is the moment, right? We've got Ronald Reagan, the most conservative president that the United States has ever had, in their words, right? He's going to be unleashed. And they're extraordinarily disappointed. 2 years in, they're looking around saying, well, we're just counting down the days until Reagan leaves office. These are people like the new right, people like Howard Phillips, Richard Viguerie, others like that, who are basically like, well, we're actually thinking about a post-Reagan era. They're beginning to do that 18 months before he leaves office.
What's his relationship with the religious right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's sort of a really interesting story. The more I that's one of the big questions, is how much did Reagan actually care about social issues personally, and how much did he do to affect, how much political capital was he willing to spend to get those things put into law? And the reality is he didn't do very much. He paid a lot of lip service to the religious right. He, of course, famously went and gave the speech, right, where he says, I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. So he paid lip service. He went and he said the right things. But when it came to sort of spending his political capital on Capitol Hill, Reagan wasn't willing to do that, right? Jesse Helms, during the Right to Life amendment debates, went to the newspapers and condemned the Reagan administration for not doing more behind the scenes to try and twist arms and whatnot. He said, I can't think of a single vote that they got us on this issue. And if you look at the president's calls, which I've done at the Reagan Library, you can actually see all the calls that the president made. President Reagan made 10 times as many calls about selling AWACS, AWACS, anti-defense missile defense system to Saudi Arabia than he did on the abortion issue, for instance. So I mean, if we just sort of think of how much he was willing to invest in an issue, he cared way more about foreign policy and economic concerns than he did about the social issues. And I mean, social conservatives, by July of 1982, in Conservative Digest, they released a whole issue dedicated, it's titled, Has Reagan Abandoned Conservatives?
Wow.
And this is published by Richard Viguerie.
Yeah.
And everyone from across the spectrum of conservatism wrote in this issue voicing their complaints about Reagan's foreign policy, about the fact that he had just raised taxes, about the fact that he hadn't done anything, in their view, on school prayer or abortion. And so 2 years in, leading members of the moral majority are saying things like, if we turn the economy around and create 10 million new jobs, but we still have millions of babies being aborted, we can't call it a victory, just 2 years into his administration. So his relationship with the new right is complicated because they didn't really have anywhere else to go. Who were they going to vote for? Were they going to vote for Mondale? I mean, so Reagan paid lip service, but insofar as like policy prescriptions, didn't really get a ton done. Now, he did appoint judges. That might be the one area, right, who were more pro-life and more conservative. And perhaps that is his greatest sort of legacy when it comes to social issues.
Okay. So I want to throw you one curveball before we talk about the relationship of Reagan to the present. And the reason it's a curveball is because your book is on conservatives, but I'd like to talk about progressives for a moment. Because just this morning, I was talking to someone about Reagan's legacy, and she said, well, he played to white voters' prejudices against blacks, and this is part of his legacy and there's of racism. Or others in the LGBTQ community might say, his legacy on the AIDS epidemic is very bad.
Yeah.
Does your book ever address the issues with he's a myth on that side too, right? He's a kind of legend on that side too.
Yeah, so the book doesn't grapple so much with Reagan's use or non-use of coded language, coded racial language. But I am actually working on a follow-up book that's on the 1980 election, looking at Reagan and Carter's deployment of former segregationists and also the deployment of coded language. And what I can say about that is that I think that what many people are doing today is they're really pulling Reagan's comments out of context. Now, I think he definitely used racially coded language from time to time. You can think of him using the term young buck, welfare queen.
Yeah,
these
welfare queen is the one that always
These things were
comes to
designed, and he did that mainly in the 1976 election. Didn't happen as much in the 1980 election.
Okay.
He was informed after he used the term young buck. He didn't know it was a racialized term, and his campaign manager told him, and he was like, oh, he was surprised by that. What I'll say is that he did use those types of tactics. But interestingly, the research for my next book, which is titled Carter's Southern Strategy, actually shows that Jimmy Carter used George Wallace, Jim Eastland, and other former segregationists on the campaign trail and campaigned right beside them to send a clear signal to working class white voters, right, that he was still a Southerner, right, and could be sort of like supported by those folks. So I think that both Reagan and Carter deployed that type of language and deployed the symbols of segregation. You can think of Strom Thurmond in Reagan's case.
Sure, right.
I think Reagan is better on race than most politicians born in 1911 were. However, I do think that Reagan believed in meritocracy and was blind to systematic injustices, such as the war on drugs, sort of the bias of the criminal, the judicial system, for instance. And so I do think there are weaknesses there.
Yeah.
Insofar as the LGBT community, it's really interesting because when Reagan was governor of California, he actually opposed the Briggs Amendment. And the Briggs Amendment was an amendment that would make it where if a school teacher was openly homosexual, if they talked about their homosexuality, they could be fired. And Reagan actually came out in the middle of this campaign when actual support was very, very high for the Briggs Amendment. It looked like it was going to pass. Reagan came out and actually opposed the measure, saying that it was a major violation of individual liberty, that it had the propensity to wreck people's lives. He, of course, spending so much time in Hollywood, had many friends who were gay, and so he seemed, at least on a personal level, at this moment, right, to interject on the right side of history, if you will. The guy, Jerry Falwell, for instance, just lambasted Reagan in 1977, 1978 for his decision to oppose the Briggs Amendment. And Briggs, of course, said Ronald Reagan is done as a national politician after opposing this, right? And this was in the heyday. This was in the Anita Bryant days where these things were passing all over the country. And so it really showed, I think, courage on Reagan's part to oppose it. Now on AIDS, I have a whole section in the book on that. I don't want to dwell too long on this one question, but I have a whole section in the book on the AIDS epidemic, and I try to contextualize that as well. The Reagan administration didn't do as much as we all would have liked for them to do, but they actually did quite a bit in terms of trying to come up with testing for the blood supply. And also important, which I mentioned in the book, is what they didn't do. Conservatives wanted them to take very, very dramatic measures to create lists of people with AIDS and to publish these lists, and the Reagan administration refused to do it. But Reagan's support for C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General, was very much behind the scenes. And so I think he can be criticized for not using the bully pulpit of the presidency, right, to really come out and say, listen, to sort of lay out the facts and ask for sort of understanding.
So we are now in the age of Trump, and conservatism is changing. So how is Reagan's role being affected in terms of just the history of conservatism or our ideas about what it is to be a conservative by what's happening now? Or can we say that at this point? Is it too soon to say?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to know exactly where conservatives are going to go. I've had the pleasure of interviewing a lot of conservatives. I get to talk to them. I go to a lot of conservative conferences to sort of speak and other things like that. And so I've been really fortunate to sort of see this happening, right, live, like fighting over, like, is conservatism about free trade and sort of globalization? Do we believe in international institutions? Is sort of a question they are asking themselves. There's major questions about immigration, right? Ronald Reagan, of course, famously granted amnesty to around 3 million undocumented immigrants. Right? And so there are major questions. The Reagan legacy and the Trump agenda are very different from one another in significant areas. Now, there are similarities. They both believed in tax cuts as a means by which to encourage capital flows into the United States and stimulate the economy. They both are big deregulators. Trump may actually outpace Reagan in terms of deregulation. I haven't seen the data on that. Carter actually outpaces Reagan in terms of deregulation, which most people don't know. But it's hard to know what the future of conservatism looks like. I think there's a battle being waged for the heart and soul of conservatism. And I think that if Trump wins a second term, he'll have a much better chance of really redefining what conservatism looks like moving into the 21st century when we see all this sort of reemergence of nationalism in Europe.
You hear people use the phrase fusionism when it comes to conservatism, sort of as though the communist enemy got the more libertarianish people together with old-fashioned conservatives. And they thought, let's get together and fight the communist enemy. And so we're going to be free marketeers, but we're also going to be pro-family and all of this kind of stuff. And now people are saying the old fusionism is falling apart, and you're seeing just a more traditional conservatism arise that isn't particularly free market, perhaps. So I'm sort of curious where where that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a crumbling of the fusion or how you want to think of it, but
yeah, I've had to grapple a lot with the concept of fusionism. I'm not I think we overstate that. I think conservatives overstate how much
Okay.
the role fusionism played. But I do think it was very real that anti-communism bound conservatives, libertarian, traditional conservatives, social conservatives all together into sort of a common cause, right? They could agree that communism, like godless communism, but also statist communism, was evil, right? And it united them from 1945 all the way through 1991 or so. And I actually argue in the book that what held the conservative movement together as sort of a replacement glue, if you will, was the Reagan legacy. That from 1991 till roughly 2010 or so, there was a common language among conservatives. Reagan provided them with, common language, common jokes, right? That he, sort of the language of Reagan, if you will, a common sort of policy prescriptions, which was very much free trade and sort of the international arena, interventionist to a certain extent, right? Sort of more hawkish on foreign policy, but a belief in sort of deregulation and free markets. I think united them in a way that anti-communism had before that time. And I think that around the rise of the Tea Party, we started to see that Reagan legacy becomes the Reagan legacy sort of morphs into this Reagan myth that Reagan was successful because he was a purist. When you and I, of course, know that Ronald Reagan raised taxes numerous times, including in 1982. He was, of course, supposedly promised spending cuts for those tax increases, but never got them. Reagan, of course, granted amnesty. Ronald Reagan worked with Tip O'Neill to save Social Security, to extend the life of Social Security. So his legacy is actually much more pragmatic. But in 2010 or so, that sort of pragmatism faded away, and we sort of got, with the rise of the Tea Party, a belief that in order to be successful, you had to be a purist and be sort of committed to your principles. And I think you see this a lot in sort of talk radio. I talk about it a little bit in the book. And I think some of that laid the foundation for the crumbling of the legacy as a glue that held everything together, and led to sort of this rise of Trump, this discontent, right?
Is that what was going on in the 2016 election when you saw the Republicans debating and it was as though they were all fighting over who was the new Reagan? I remember being really struck by that. I thought, why are we talking about Reagan all of a sudden all the time? And Rudy Giuliani and, Trump and who's carrying on Reagan's legacy? And I thought, where is this coming from? Why is this all of a sudden on everyone's minds?
Yeah, that first started in 2008. It was the first, of course, George W. Bush had a tribute to Reagan in 2004 because Reagan had died right before the convention. And so he actually uses Reagan's image and brings Nancy in and Michael Reagan. And Bush really channels that. But in 2008, without having an incumbent, is the first time we see this. And everybody on the stage in 2008 is trying to fill Reagan's boots. They do it again in 2012. They all try to be the next Ronald Reagan. They even make bracelets, right, in 2005, 2006 that say WWRD, what would Reagan do, right? And so there's this attempt that everything will be okay if we can only go back to whatever it was, right, that Reagan was. We need to return back. And so, 2016 was no different. Most of the candidates wanted to sort of embody Ronald Reagan. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul got involved in that debate, and the book details this in the final chapters. The one candidate who was not interested in being the next Ronald Reagan was Donald Trump. And whereas the other candidates would talk about Reagan on the debate stage, I can only remember one or two times when Trump even mentioned Reagan on the debate stage, because I forced myself to watch every single one of those debates, right? It was research. But the one time that I can really remember Trump talking about Reagan, he goes, well, Jeb, Ronald Reagan said he admired me.
Oh, as a businessman.
Yeah, so he was you all admire Ronald Reagan, but Ronald Reagan admired me. It's the most Trump thing you could possibly do.
I'm setting the new
right?
standard, right? It's over.
And he broke away from the policy prescriptions, right? He advocated for, he used very, very harsh language, I think it can be described, towards immigrants, advocated for tariffs as a means by which to sort of solve the trade imbalance, etc. And I think that was definitely a deviation from the legacy. If not so much, Reagan actually did raise tariffs on some goods and stuff during the 80s, but definitely a demarcation, if you will, from the Reagan legacy and myth that the rest of the candidates seem to be, embracing.
When you bring up this history with conservatives who lived through the era, what do you hear? Do they say, oh, yeah, that's right? Or do they say, I'm just curious, are they pushing back on you when you're reminding them of some of this conservative concern about Reagan?
Yeah, it's always interesting when you talk to conservatives about this. I speak, like I said, I frequently talk to conservative conservatives at conferences and other things like that. I've been lucky enough to interview people like Morton Blackwell, Arthur Laffer, and others. And the one that sticks out to me is a conversation that I had with Ed Fulner. And I don't think he'd mind me sharing this with you. We were talking, and he was like, "What's your book about?" And we got to chatting about it, and he goes, "Reagan was a really great president." I was like, okay, I agree, but like, you actually published, right, the Heritage Foundation, a very large, like I think it's 400 or 500 page like analysis 2 years in, and you basically said that there were tons of missed opportunities and gave Reagan a very poor grade in terms of like how he was doing. And most of these conservatives will tell you, yeah, we did, right? We were very critical of the Reagan administration. Now, in Richard Viguery's case, when I interviewed him, he told me like that was my job, as being someone on the outside, was to pull Reagan as far as I possibly could to the right. And so if I had to write an op-ed that was scathing, I wrote an op-ed that was scathing, right? And if you read the book, you'll see a lot of really, really incendiary things that conservatives published about Reagan. For instance, my favorite source in the entire book is a newspaper ad that Howard Phillips, the chairman of the Conservative Caucus, or the president of the Conservative Caucus, published in the Washington Times. And they ran it in hundreds of conservative newspapers across the country. And this ad had a picture of Ronald Reagan, and it had a picture of Neville Chamberlain, it had a picture of Mikhail Gorbachev, and a picture of Adolf Hitler. And it said, appeasement is as bad in 1988 as it was in 1938, right? Implying that the INF Treaty was going to be a nuclear Munich, which is what Jack Kemp called it. Or as our good friend George Will said, right, that was the day that they signed the INF Treaty was the day the Cold War was lost.
Whoops. I always call that argumentum ad Hitlerum, right?
Yeah.
Compare it to Hitler, right?
Yeah.
That is fascinating, and I think so surprising when we think back, just in terms of the way we talk about Reagan now.
Yeah.
So let's say we wanted to get your book and read it. How would we do that?
Yeah, so the book is obviously available on Amazon. Just Getting Right with Reagan, The Struggle for True Conservatism, or you can also get it from the press directly, University Press of Kansas.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been
thanks.
a great conversation. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rachel Ferguson with the Hammond Institute at Lindenwood University. And if you want to find out more, go to hammondinstitute.org. We have actually a video of one of your talks presenting this book, as well as many other great resources there. So please find out what we have by visiting our website. Thank you.